Thank you. Centuries before the empire, long before the Republic, Rome was a monarchy. This is the story of Rome and how it almost never came to be. Thank you. The myth of Rome stretches across Europe and the Mediterranean, from Spain to Greece to North Africa, where you'll find the ruins of once majestic buildings, evidence of a civilization that thrived for over 1,000 years and still found a way to continue even after its fall. This was Rome, an expansionist power that has been recognized and studied more than any other in history. But before it was a continent-spanning militaristic empire, it was far less, and nobody knew what it was destined to become. According to the famous foundation myth of Rome, the story starts here on the Italian peninsula. The city of Alba Longa, part of a small community of Latin cities resting south of the Tiber River, was ruled by King Numita. The Latins claimed descent from the legendary Aeneas, a hero from the Trojan War who left the devastated city and traveled west, settling in Italy. King Numita had an envious brother, Amulius. Younger than Numita, Amulius would never see the throne, as Numita had many sons who were next in line. So Amulius did the only thing he could do. He had the king's sons murdered and ran Numita himself out of the city. Numita's daughter, Rhea Silvia, was also made to become a priestess of the goddess Vesta, which would become known as a Vestal Virgin. She was to remain chaste under penalty of death, effectively killing her child to the Numita's successor. Amulius was unaware, though, that Rhea Silvia was already pregnant with twins from the god Mars. Once they were born, Amulius ordered both to be drowned in the Tiber River. His servant brought them to the river, but it was in flood, so the babies, named Remus and Romulus, were left on the riverbank to die of exposure. It all could have ended here if not for a she-wolf named Lupa. She found the twins and nursed them back to health. Soon after, a shepherd found the infants and took them in, raising them. Once the boys became adults, they got their revenge on Amulius, deposing him and restoring Numita to the throne. The twins then set out to found a city for themselves near the Tiber River, where they were found as infants. But Numita and Amulius's familial patterns manifested in Remus and Romulus, and they began to bicker over who should be king of this new city. To solve this problem, they asked the gods for a sign. Remus went to wait on the Aventine Hill, the hill he preferred to build the city on, while Romulus waited on the Palatine Hill. Remus was the first to see a sign. 6 birds flew by. Ancient Roman religion interpreted omens from the behavior of birds. Later on, Romulus saw 12 birds. Both believed they won, as Remus saw his sign first, but Romulus saw double the amount. Deciding to settle the dispute in a more conventional method, they came to physical blows, and during the fight, Remus was killed by his brother. Romulus then founded the city of Rome around the Palatine Hill, naming it after himself. The legendary date for this was April 21, 753 BCE. Apart from this myth, the true story of Rome's founding is perhaps lost to history. The oldest Roman sources we currently have are from around the turn of the millennium, and they were clearly influenced by stories from other cultures, from the Greeks, the myth of a virgin birth like that of Dionysus, and similarities to the story of the twins Castor and Pollux. From further east, they took aspects of the story of the birth of Sargon of Akkad, which in turn influenced the story of the birth of Moses. Archaeological discoveries tell us other parts of the myth could possibly be based in reality. Settlements seem to have begun in the 900s BCE, and we believe Rome itself began as 2 settlements, one on the Aventine Hill and one on the Palatine Hill, occupied by different Latin tribes, perhaps joining sometime in the 600s BCE. It's possible the Palatine Hill tribe overcame the Aventine, which parallels the Romulus and Remus story. These weren't the only hills in the area. While the Palatine Hill was the nucleus, Rome eventually expanded to cover 7 nearby hills. The hills made the area easy to defend, and the Tiber River was a perfect natural barrier as well. Early Romans were mainly farmers, taking advantage of the fertile plains of the Tiber, and so Rome had almost everything it needed to thrive. But how can one thrive in so small a space? While Rome was growing, Italy was already filled with other cultures and civilizations. Directly around them were the other Latin tribes, all descended from the Italic language family, part of the Indo-Europeans. In the south of Italy was what the Romans would call Magna Graecia, colonies from Greece which we have mentioned in previous episodes of this chapter. Across the Tiber to the north were the Etruscans, a loose alliance of cities that controlled all of northern Italy until the Po Valley. The Etruscans were not Indo-European, predating their arrival, but they would eventually be influenced by the Greeks. They adopted the Greek alphabet, adopted Greek gods, and traded extensively with the Greeks. Rome's beginnings weren't much different from the other Latin tribes in the region. They were just a small kingdom and would stay this way until the late 500s. Roman history claims that 7 kings ruled over Rome, starting with Romulus in 753 BCE. Son of Mars, the god of war, Rome under Romulus was filled with conflict. The most notorious incident involved the Sabines, a nearby Italic tribe. According to Livy, the Roman historian, Romulus had opened up his new settlement to fugitives and travelers in order to grow the city, which stagnated at a population of around 3,000. But this caused a very disproportionate male population. To remedy this, he held a festival and invited the Sabines to join. At his signal, his men abducted all the young Sabine women and took them for themselves. Anywhere from 30 to almost 700 women were kidnapped. Furious, the Sabine army, composed of the women's fathers and husbands, marched on Rome repeatedly, but the women urged them, they were treated well, and there was no need for bloodshed. The men were convinced, and there was peace. Both the Romans and Sabines created a joint kingdom. Though Rome began as a kingdom, the king wasn't an autocratic ruler. Romulus had established the Senate, a body of 100 noblemen which served as an advisory council and kept the king in check. Other citizens would be represented in the Curiate Assembly. After Romulus died around 716 BCE, it was the Senate who chose the next king, who took power in 715 BCE, Numa Pompilius. Numa was a Sabine, but most likely also legendary. Under his rule, Rome became less militaristic and grew into a more civilized society. He constructed the Temple of Janus, and after establishing peace with Rome's neighbors, closed the doors of the temple, signifying a new beginning for Rome, free of conflict. He established the Vestal Virgins in Rome, along with the cults of Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus, the latter of which was thought to be a deified Romulus. The Roman calendar was also reformed, and he established the position of chief priest of Rome, called Pontifex Maximus. In 672 BCE, Numa died, with Rome still at peace. The next king, however, Tullus Hostilius, brought back Rome's killer instinct. He waged war with all surrounding cities, including the Etruscan cities to the north and the remnants of the Sabine region. More importantly, Alba Longa, the Latin city from which Rome originated, was conquered and destroyed. Tullus died around 640 BCE, said to be struck by a lightning bolt from Jupiter. The next king, Ancus Marcius, was King Numa's grandson and continued his peaceful methods. He used diplomacy to unite the smaller Latin cities around Rome and relocate them to the Aventine Hill. Ancus was also responsible for founding the important port of Ostia and the building of Rome's first aqueduct. Rome's fifth king, taking power in 616 BCE, was Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, or Tarquin the Elder. He wasn't Latin or Sabine but Etruscan. He migrated to the city at a young age as a wealthy nobleman. Sources differ, but he either bribed his way to the top or was chosen by the former king Ancus as an heir. This began a period of Etruscan influence over Rome. The Etruscans had been older, more established, and more developed than Rome, and now the Romans became more familiar with their culture, a culture which itself was influenced by Greece. After a 38-year rule, he was replaced by his son-in-law Servius Tullius, who was king for over 40 years. Both of these Etruscan kings were quite beneficial to Rome, fending off attacks from other Etruscan kings to the north and subduing some Latin cities to the south. The accumulated wealth was used for magnificent building projects. Under Tarquin, Rome constructed the Circus Maximus, a stadium for chariot racing and other mass entertainment. Also under his rule, the Cloaca Maxima was built, regarded as one of the earliest sewage systems in the world. This drained the site of what would become the Roman Forum, a plaza that became the center of Roman social and political life. The Forum has undergone many changes over the centuries, with countless additions and improvements, and is still an archaeological site today. Tarquin also built the Roman walls, known as the Servian walls, made from volcanic tuff stone. The Roman Forum would become a vast site, with many legendary buildings and temples added to it over the centuries. But the last Roman king wouldn't be remembered as fondly. This was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. Taking power in 535 BCE, his rule was absolutely tyrannical. He ignored the Senate and was more of a dictator than a king. He executed anyone who opposed him and engaged in endless war with surrounding cities, even conquering more land, but still built the massive temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Finally, in 509 BCE, the last straw broke. Tarquin's son, Sextus, violated the wife of a nobleman named Collatinus. Outraged, Collatinus and a senator named Lucius Junius Brutus incited a rebellion. They deposed and exiled Tarquin, abolishing the kingship altogether and founding the Roman Republic. The Etruscans tried to bring back the monarchy but were defeated by Roman forces at the Battle of Silva Arcia. Tarquin and his family then fled to the city of Cumae in the south, where he died in 495 BCE. Lucius Junius Brutus, the co-leader of the rebellion, was an ancestor of the more famous Marcus Junius Brutus, who took part in the assassination of Julius Caesar 450 years later. At this point, Rome had undergone two different forms of government: the monarchy, founded by Romulus, and the republic, founded by Lucius Brutus. After centuries of conflict and development, the city began its rise to power. Next time, we'll begin exploring how the Roman Republic evolved and how the road to Rome's ultimate destiny began to be paved. The main accomplishment of Tarquin's reign was the completion of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the most important temple in ancient Rome. However, the tipping point in his rule occurred when the king's son sexually assaulted Lucretia, the daughter of a prominent Roman nobleman. In her shame, Lucretia took her own life, her lifeless body publicly displayed in the square. Her husband, Tarquinius Collatinus, pleaded with the people to avenge this wrongdoing. Collatinus and his friend, Junius Brutus, rallied the citizens to revolt. While King Tarquin was out of the city, Collatinus and Brutus took control, and upon Tarquin's return, the city gates were closed to him, forcing him into exile in 509 BCE. With the last of the 7 Roman kings deposed, the Roman kingdom was dissolved and reformed. According to Livy, though this account may not be fully accurate and could be influenced by Greek tales of tyrants, it serves as an explanation of how the Romans freed themselves from foreign rule, as their last 3 kings were Etruscan. The Senate abolished the monarchy, and Collatinus and Brutus were elected as leaders, holding the title of consuls, with the power to veto each other's decisions. Their term was limited to 1 year, after which they could be prosecuted for any abuse of power. Despite holding the highest office, they would not be kings, they were instead consuls. This marked the end of the Roman kingdom and the birth of the Roman Republic in 509 BCE, though modern historians question this date, suspecting it may have been adjusted to predate the founding of Athens and Athenian democracy in 508 or 507 BCE. Regardless of which came first, Rome and Athens took different paths. As Rome faced external threats, including attempts by the Etruscans to reclaim their cities, Rome appointed its first dictator, a man granted full power of the state, though only for a 6-month term. This position was designed as an emergency role, not a return to kingship, and Roman citizens were encouraged to assassinate any dictator who tried to hold on to power longer. For centuries, no dictator defied this rule. Rome successfully fought back against the Etruscans, who, losing their own territories in the Po Valley to the Gauls, began expanding southward. The Gauls, part of the Celtic tribes, emerged north of the Alps and spread throughout Western Europe, eventually establishing settlements like Milan and Verona in northern Italy. With Rome to their south and the Gauls to the north, the Etruscans became a displaced nuisance between two powerful foes destined to clash. While external conflicts brewed, Rome faced internal struggles as well. The conflict of the orders, a class struggle between wealthy landowners, the patricians, and the commoners, the plebeians, lasted from around 500 to 287 BCE. The plebeians, who greatly outnumbered the patricians but had far less wealth and power, were effectively shut out of the government. They were also at constant risk of falling into slavery if they couldn't repay debts owed to the patricians. This tension reached a peak around 495 BCE when an old soldier, now a slave due to debt, told his story in the Roman Forum. The plebeians, realizing their power in numbers, went on strike, refusing to fight in Rome's wars. This first secession of the plebs led to the creation of the office of plebeian tribune, giving the plebeians a voice in government and the power to veto legislation. Over the next few decades, power remained balanced between the consuls, senate, and tribune. In 451 BCE, Rome, inspired by Solon of Athens, created a fair law code known as the Laws of the 12 Tables. Though not all laws favored the plebeians, this new legal framework laid the foundation for Roman law and was a direct result of the plebeian secession. With internal tensions eased, Rome turned its attention to external conflicts, particularly with the Etruscan city of Veii, just 16 kilometers from Rome. The Romans laid siege to Veii for many years, finally taking the city in 396 BCE. However, the prolonged siege left Rome vulnerable, and in 387 BCE, the Gauls under Brennus invaded and occupied Rome for 7 months, the only time the city would be occupied by foreigners for 800 years. Rome was saved by disease that struck the Gauls, forcing them to accept a Roman offer of gold to leave the city. According to Livy, Marcus Furius Camillus, Roman general and dictator, returned from exile at this moment and defeated the Gauls, though this account is debated. Despite the devastation, Rome rebuilt, and with renewed resolve, began its rise to power. The sack of Rome, rather than destroying the city, marked a rebirth. Camillus was hailed as the second founder of Rome, and the city emerged stronger than before. This period of Rome's history, from its early struggles to its rebirth after the Gallic sack, set the stage for its future dominance. As Rome continued its campaigns in Italy, the shape of Europe was about to change. The next chapter in history will follow the rise of Macedonia under one of the greatest generals of all time, Alexander the Great.